The handcuffs were already out. Chief Raymond Stoddard had them in his fist, swinging them forward when the phone on his belt lit up. He didn't look at it. He'd given this particular order 11 minutes ago, and he intended to see it through. The woman standing at the center of the Meridian Hotel's marble lobby, black, 40-ish, composed in a way that made his deputies visibly uncomfortable, had not moved, had not flinched, had not raised her voice. She'd simply placed one hand flat on the mahogany check-in desk and said, in a tone so quiet it carried to every corner of the room, that he should be very careful about what he did next. Stoddard's deputies were watching him. 40 hotel guests had stopped moving. 3 television cameras from the governor's press convoy were still rolling, and the phone on his belt was still lit up. He clicked the handcuffs open anyway. What he did not know, what would end his career before the evening news finished its first broadcast, was that the woman he was about to arrest had spent the last 14 months building the legal case that would determine whether Raymond Stoddard ever wore a badge again. 2 years earlier, Camille Archer drove into Caldwell County for the first time and immediately understood 3 things. The town was smaller than the file had suggested, the courthouse was larger than any town this size needed, and somebody had been spending money here that did not belong to them. She'd grown up in a place like this, rural Georgia, a county where the same 4 families had run everything from the sheriff's office to the school board since before her grandmother was born. She knew the particular architecture of that kind of power, the way it made itself look like permanence, like the natural order of things, like something you'd be foolish to question. She'd spent 22 years since leaving that county learning the precise legal vocabulary for what it actually was. Camille held a law degree from Howard University, a master's in public policy from Georgetown, and had served as senior counsel in 2 different state attorneys' general offices before the governor of this state. A woman named Frances Okafor, 7 months into her first term and already earning the specific enemies that come with meaning what you say, recruited her as chief legal counsel. She was 43 years old. She wore her hair natural and her suits well-tailored, and she had a manner in meetings that junior attorneys described, privately and admiringly, as making you feel like she already knows how this ends. Governor Okafor had sent her to Caldwell County on an assignment that did not appear on any official calendar. Not because it was secret, exactly. Camille Archer did not operate in secrecy, but because it was preliminary. The governor had received a letter, a handwritten letter, 4 pages, from a retired county clerk named Evelyn Marsh, who was 71 years old and had kept every record she'd ever touched, and who had, over 32 years of watching, assembled a picture of financial redirection in Caldwell County that she was prepared to document if someone with appropriate authority was prepared to listen. Camille was prepared to listen. She'd driven out alone, as a private individual, to meet Evelyn Marsh at a diner 11 miles from the county seat, and she'd spent 3 hours going through Evelyn's records with the focused attention she brought to everything. By the end of those 3 hours, she wasn't preliminary anymore. What Evelyn Marsh had: invoices, disbursement records, vendor contracts that led back to shell companies, a pattern across 11 fiscal years, was not the complaint of a disgruntled retiree. It was the skeleton of a prosecutable case. She'd gone back 4 more times over the following months. She'd brought no staff, filed no official requests, made no calls from county territory that could be traced to the governor's office. She was building the foundation before anyone knew there was going to be a structure. That was how she worked. Quietly, completely, in the direction of something she couldn't yet name in open court, but could feel in the architecture of the documents, the way a structural engineer feels a compromised beam. What she had not fully accounted for was that in a county where the same families had run everything for generations, a black woman making repeat visits to Evelyn Marsh's home was not invisible. And Raymond Stoddard, chief of the Caldwell County Police Department, 21 years in, the kind of man who understood that his position depended entirely on the continued health of arrangements Evelyn Marsh had spent 32 years documenting, had a very efficient network of eyes. Stoddard was not an unintelligent man. That was the important thing to understand about him, the thing that made what he'd built sustainable for as long as it had been. He didn't take more than the system could absorb. He didn't make enemies carelessly. He'd cultivated relationships with the county commissioners, the 2 state legislators from this district. And this was the detail that would matter enormously in about 11 minutes. A deputy chief of staff in the governor's office, who had been in his fraternity in 1987, and who had, on more than one occasion, provided the early warning that kept Stoddard ahead of situations like this one. He'd gotten his warning about Camille Archer 3 weeks into her visits to Evelyn Marsh. He'd done his research. He knew she was an attorney. He did not know, because his contact in the governor's office genuinely did not know, operating 2 levels below where this assignment lived, that she was the governor's chief legal counsel. His research told him she was a private attorney, possibly hired by Marsh or one of Marsh's associates, doing the kind of preliminary document work that preceded a civil suit. A nuisance, potentially, not a threat. He'd made a decision. If she was building a civil case, the fastest way to derail it was to establish, in a public record, that she was operating improperly, trespassing, interfering with official documents. Something that would attach itself to her name and her bar license and make any case she tried to bring smell like the work of a compromised attorney. He needed her to be somewhere he could document her doing something he could characterize as a violation. The governor's regional press event at the Meridian Hotel was his opportunity. The governor would be there. The hotel would be crowded. Security would be layered. And Camille Archer, who he'd had quietly tracked for 6 days, had a reservation at the Meridian for that night, which suggested she would be in the building, which gave him the location he needed. He arrived with 4 deputies and a prepared narrative. The attorney had been observed attempting to access restricted areas of the governor's secure perimeter. It was thin. He knew it was thin, but thin charges stuck to people all the time when the person bringing them wore a badge and the person receiving them was standing in a lobby with handcuffs moving toward their wrists. That was what he'd built 21 years on. The gap between what was true and what the record said. He'd closed that gap more times than he could count. He had not, in all those times, encountered Camille Archer. She'd been at the check-in desk for 4 minutes when Stoddard's deputies entered the lobby. She saw them immediately. She always saw the room before the room saw her. An instinct developed across decades of being a black woman in spaces that had not been designed with her safety as a priority. She watched them fan out. She watched Stoddard come through the main doors. She recognized him from the county records, from the photographs, from the 11 years of financial documents in which his name appeared in the margins of arrangements that should have had his name nowhere near them. She did not move. She placed her hand flat on the mahogany desk and waited. What Stoddard announced, in the voice of a man performing for an audience, was that she was being detained for questioning in connection with unauthorized access to restricted security areas. He used the language precisely, detained for questioning, not arrested, because he wasn't quite stupid enough to say arrested without something more solid under him. But the handcuffs coming out told the room what detained for questioning meant in practice. Camille said, in a voice calibrated to carry without rising, "You should be very careful about what you do next." Stoddard's deputies were watching him. He recognized the moment for what it was, a public test, one he couldn't back down from without losing the authority that made everything else work. He clicked the handcuffs open. The phone on his belt lit up. He didn't look at it. He stepped forward, and from the far end of the lobby, moving through the crowd with the particular speed of someone who has been briefed and is furious and has decided that no further briefing is necessary, came the deputy governor of the state, a man named Robert Calloway, who had just come from the governor's private reception room, where he'd spent the last 9 minutes on the phone with Frances Okafor being told exactly who Camille Archer was and exactly what she had been doing in Caldwell County for the past 14 months. Calloway was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. He stopped 6 feet from Stoddard and said his name once, Chief Stoddard. And the way he said it, the register of it, made 3 of the 4 deputies take a half step backward without realizing they'd done it. Then Robert Calloway said 11 words. "You are attempting to arrest the governor's chief legal counsel. Put those away." The lobby did not go quiet. It had already gone quiet, the way large rooms do when the people in them understand that something real is occurring. The 3 television cameras were still rolling. They had been rolling the entire time. Stoddard's hand stopped moving. The handcuffs, open and swinging, caught the light from the lobby's chandelier. He looked at Calloway. He looked at Camille. He looked at the cameras. His face, in that specific sequence of 3 seconds, was a document. Every calculation he'd spent 21 years keeping below the surface was suddenly and completely visible. He said, in a voice that had lost its performance, "I wasn't informed." "No," Calloway said. "You weren't. That was intentional." The next 72 hours moved the way things move when the machinery of accountability, once engaged, finds that the foundation has been undermining itself for years and has very little left to hold against the weight. Stoddard was placed on administrative leave the following morning, pending a review requested jointly by the governor's office and the state attorney general. The review was not a formality. Camille's 14 months of quiet, meticulous groundwork meant that the moment official authority was applied to the question of Caldwell County's finances, the answers were already organized and waiting. The shell companies, the vendor contracts, the 11 years of redirected funds, the specific invoices that connected the financial architecture to individuals whose names appeared in Stoddard's professional network like load-bearing columns in a building that was now scheduled for demolition. He hired an attorney. The attorney reviewed the documentation and had a conversation with Stoddard that Stoddard later described, to the people who were still speaking to him, as the worst hour of his life. The documentation was not ambiguous. It had been assembled by someone who understood that ambiguity was the gap criminals lived in, and who had spent 14 months removing every inch of it. Evelyn Marsh, 71 years old and 32 years worth of careful record-keeping, sat in the state attorney general's offices 2 weeks later and answered questions for 4 hours. She was precise. She was steady. She brought her files in 3 labeled boxes and referenced them without being asked. The attorney who conducted the interview told a colleague afterward that it was the most organized witness testimony she had encountered in 9 years of practice. The case that followed was not brief. Federal involvement came in the 5th month, when the financial redirections were traced across enough jurisdictions to cross the threshold. Stoddard's deputy chief of staff contact in the governor's office, the fraternity brother who'd provided the early warning, was identified within the first 60 days and cooperated within the first 90, trading what he knew for a reduction in his own exposure. The commissioners whose names appeared in the financial architecture were examined one by one. The trial, when it came, lasted 3 weeks. The verdict, when it came, was not complicated. Stoddard was convicted on 11 counts. He was sentenced to 7 years. He lost his pension, his badge, and the 21 years of careful arrangement maintenance that had been, in the end, a structure built on a foundation he'd never subjected to honest inspection. The governor held a press conference the day the sentencing was announced. She spoke about Caldwell County's residents, the people whose tax dollars had been redirected, whose roads had gone unrepaired, whose school funding had been quietly skimmed for more than a decade. She spoke about Evelyn Marsh by name, with her permission, and said that the courage it took to write a 4-page handwritten letter and trust that someone would drive out to listen was the kind of courage that governments were built to deserve, and too rarely did. She did not speak about Camille Archer by name, because Camille Archer had specifically asked her not to, on the grounds that the work spoke for itself and the people who needed to know her name already did. This was characteristic. Camille had never been interested in the credit. She was interested in the outcome, which was a different and more disciplined thing. Camille was in her office when the press conference aired, on the small television mounted in the corner that she kept on during major announcements and ignored the rest of the time. She watched the governor speak. She watched the statement about Evelyn Marsh. She watched the faces of the reporters who'd covered the case for 3 weeks and who were still, some of them, working through what it meant that the entire legal architecture of the prosecution had been constructed by one woman over 14 months without a single official filing or publicly traceable action. She turned off the television. She picked up the next file on her desk. There was always a next file. There were counties all over this state where someone like Evelyn Marsh had been keeping records for decades. There were patterns that looked like permanence until someone looked at them long enough and with the right language. There were arrangements that had survived for years on the assumption that the person who noticed them would either not know what they were looking at or would know and choose not to act. Camille Archer had never in her life chosen not to act. She had chosen, many times, how and when and with what preparation. She had chosen to be quiet before she was loud, to be thorough before she was visible, to build the case before she announced it. She had learned, growing up in a county that looked a great deal like Caldwell County, that the people who ran those places counted on one thing above all others. They counted on the assumption that the people who saw them clearly did not have the tools to make anyone else see. She had spent 22 years becoming someone who could hand anyone a document and make what was hidden completely, irreversibly plain. She opened the next file. She began to read. In the lobby of the Meridian Hotel, 11 months after the night Stoddard's handcuffs had swung open in the chandelier light and the cameras had caught every second of it, a bronze plaque had been quietly installed near the mahogany check-in desk. The hotel's manager, a woman who had watched the entire scene from behind the concierge station, had commissioned it without announcement and paid for it out of her own budget. It said nothing about Camille Archer. It said nothing about Raymond Stoddard. It said only this: in this lobby, on this date, the record was corrected. Most guests walked past it without reading it. A few stopped. The ones who stopped tended to stand there for a moment longer than they expected to. Some things, once seen plainly, take a moment to absorb.